Hello, welcome back to Western Civilization 101 in our lecture series. We are discussing the ancient Roman world. We've already learned a little bit about other groups of people that lived in or on this Italian peninsula, other than the Romans, of course. For example, the Etruscans. And we've learned about the influences that the Etruscans had as far as the Romans are concerned, with maybe like the toga and architecture and the style of fighting, and just how the Etruscans influenced the Romans. Now, the city of Rome was founded about, I guess, 753 BC is the traditional date for the founding of the city of Rome. And of course, you had those legendary founders of the city of Rome called Romulus and Remus. They were actually the twin sons of the god of war. His name was Mars. Actually, in Greek mythology, the god of war would be Ares. So his counterpart in on the Roman side of things would be Mars. He was a very important deity in Roman religion. Now, supposedly, according to the legend, of course, they were placed, these two boys, Romulus and Remus, were placed into a basket and put into the Tiber River. Eventually, they came to rest upon a bank on the side of the river, and a wolf, a she-wolf, found them and raised them, nursed them, of course, and eventually they would find the city of Rome. So that's the legend, obviously, because, you know, a wolf raising human babies would be very hard to do. Now, the earliest form of government, as far as the Roman civilization is concerned, is the topic of this lecture today by Dr. Price on the Roman monarchy. The earliest form of government was the monarchy in Rome, where they have a king. You can think of it as the first branch of government, a kind of father figure there. And they had, you could think of it as a second branch of government. They had a senate or a council of elders. You've heard a lot about a council of elders when we were discussing Greek civilization. Well, the Romans also had this as well. And then you also had, of course, an assembly. We've heard that term before when we were discussing Greek civilization. We also have it again here in the ancient Roman world. There was, I guess you could say, a third branch, which was an assembly. It was made up of all adult male citizens. Now, Rome will go through many phases in its history. Very long history for Roman civilization. Of course, the earliest phase was the Roman monarchy. Eventually, there's a traditional story or a legend as to how this monarchy ended and how the word king was just vilified in later Roman society. You would never call yourself king, okay? That was not a good thing for your health and for your welfare if you called yourself, I don't know, King Philip or King Caesar, whatever. You could not do that. In the traditional end of this monarchy, in the beginning of what is called a republic, which will also be a topic for a future lecture, it's associated, and also the end of Etruscan domination, because the Etruscans had the monarchy as well. So the end of the monarchy and the end of Etruscan domination was with the rape of Lucretia. Lucretia, this is a legend, of course, but Lucretia, around 534 BC, was the wife. She was a very great person, very virtuous. She was a Roman wife. And she was raped by the son of an Etruscan tyrant by the name of Tarquin the Proud. He goes by others, but that's his simple name, Tarquin the Proud. His son raped her. And according to the legend, she committed suicide because she couldn't live with her shame. And The Romans revolted around 509 BC and overthrew the Etruscans and overthrew the monarchical, or the monarchy is better, form of government also. And Rome became a republic around 509 BC. A republic, of course, without a monarchy. No king for the republic. And you know, when we were talking about Greek civilization, we also learned that a lot of city-states went through different phases of government. So Rome is not exactly unique in this aspect. You know, our lecture today will talk about more in detail about the Roman monarchy, of course, around 509 BC. Either way, no matter what happened or what story took place, the Romans revolted and started their early republic period. And then, of course, there is the late republic. Eventually, Rome becomes an empire. They start becoming imperialistic, aggressive expansion. We have lots of fighting and warfare taking place later on in Roman society, Roman civilization. So we enter into an empire stage with Roman history and a late empire. And eventually, before we end discussing the early and the ancient Roman world, we'll find out what happens to this magnificent Roman empire that stretched. I mean, Rome conquered so many areas. They had so many areas on the European continent even, and in Asia that were under their control and domination. And we'll find out eventually, how did they fall? I mean, what happened to such a great empire to where it doesn't exist anymore? It's very interesting to find that answer. And eventually, throughout the lectures for the Roman world, we'll find that answer out. So let's go ahead and learn about that first stage, the earliest stage of Roman government. Let's learn about the Roman monarchy.
Today we'll begin a new unit with a new civilization, or at least a civilization that we haven't talked about yet, and that civilization is the Romans. Now today I want to tell you a little bit about how Rome began and how its political and social system was organized. First of all, Rome probably came into existence sometime in the 8th century, the early 700s BC. It was located at a very good crossing of the Tiber River, about 12 miles from the western coast of Italy, on a plain, a broad river plain that's called the Plain of Latium. There were 3 different people, important groups of people, who met here in this early period and traded. These 3 were the Latins. This is the ancestors of the Romans themselves. The Sabines, who were south of the river, and the Etruscans to the north. Now, to the north lived the tribes of Etruscans. The Etruscans would be an incredibly important civilizing influence on the Romans. It is not really known how the Etruscans came to northern Italy. Some folks believe that they may have come from Asia, that they may have come from Asia Minor. At any rate, they're not Indo-European speakers. They are speakers of some other language group, and we're not entirely sure what that group is. In some respects, the culture of the Etruscans was similar to the culture of the Mycenaeans, but we don't think that they're Mycenaean Greeks. Their cities, there were 12 of them in number, were autonomous and independent, rather like the city-states of Sumeria and even like the polises of Greece. And they were probably combined into a loose organization, a loose confederation, which historians often refer to as the Etruscan Confederacy. Material objects found from archaeological digs in Tuscany, in various Etruscan city-states, show that they had great luxury, great wealth, great opulence, and were an aristocratic form of government. As a people, we know that the Etruscans played hard and worked hard. They were not a contemplative sort of people like the Greeks. They were always busy. They were practical and realistic, and these are habits of mind that we will see are inherited by the Romans. They become Roman traits as well. We could argue that whereas the Greeks were thinkers, the Etruscans and Romans were doers. The Romans would adopt many Etruscan customs over the years. They used the Etruscan alphabet, which the Etruscans themselves had borrowed from the Greeks. The symbol of the Etruscan king's right to execute his subjects, in essence, the symbol of Etruscan power, was called the fasces, and the Romans would take this symbol over along with the toga, which was originally an Etruscan form of dress. They would take these symbols over and these forms of clothing over themselves. In architecture, the vault and the arch were Etruscan in origin, and the Romans would make great use of them, and the gladiatorial games that the Romans became rather addicted to by late in their history were also originally Etruscan forms of activity. Now, Etruscan power and influence over the city of Rome was extraordinarily strong, and thanks to their trading interests, the city of Rome began to grow. By the mid-6th century, temples and public buildings could be found throughout this growing town of Rome. The Capitoline Hill in Rome became the religious center of the city, and the Forum, which had originally been a cemetery, became the public meeting place, rather like the agora that the Greeks had in their city-state. At first, in its earliest period, starting in the 700s, Rome was a kingdom. And Roman tradition tells us that for several generations, Rome was ruled by a family of Etruscan kings. Now, what we believe happened is the Etruscans may have expanded and acquired Rome around the 700s, the mid-700s, and then these Etruscan kings were actually Etruscan governors who were in control of the Roman state. According to the tradition, the son of the last Etruscan king, a fellow by the name of Tarquin the Proud, raped a respected Roman woman named Lucretia. She reported the rape to her husband and then committed suicide rather than live with the shame of being raped by a stranger, the dishonor of being the victim of this rape. And this event, according to Roman tradition, caused the Romans to rebel against their Etruscan masters, against Tarquin. And according to Roman historians and Roman tradition, in 509 the Etruscans were cast out of Rome and a republic was formed. The monarchy was ended in this revolution. The Roman people established an independent Roman republic in its place. Now, this is the beginning of the famous Roman Republic that would last from 509 BC down to 27 BC, when the Roman Republic would come to an end and be replaced with a Roman Empire. Now, when I say a government is a republic, this means it's not really a democracy, but it is a government that is a mixture of democratic rule, aristocratic rule, and some kind of executive, some replacement for the monarchy. In Greek terms, we would say that the executive branch of some sort, like elected officials or a king, that it has a council of elders, and that it has an assembly of male citizens who bear arms for the state. All three of these institutions, as it were, share power, and each of them has designated authority and designated duties within the state. And essentially, the Roman Republic works very much that way as well. There are basically three key political bodies in the early Roman Republic. They are an assembly called the Centuriate Assembly. This is the assembly of all the men who bear arms for the Roman state. The Senate, which is the Council of Rome, and two annually elected chief magistrates, chief officials, who are called the consuls. These are the ruling executives of the Roman state: the Centuriate Assembly, the Senate, and the consuls. So let's take a look at each one of them in turn. The Centuriate Assembly is a legislative assembly very similar to those that existed in Greek city-states. It's made up of citizen soldiers, adult males who can afford to buy their military equipment and therefore can afford to serve in the army in defense of the state. But unlike the Greek citizen assemblies, in which each person had one vote, the Centuriate Assembly doesn't have an equal vote for every citizen. The assembly votes by centuries, hence the term centuriate. It votes in military units of 40 and 100 men. In the centuries, each person has a vote. In the century, each person has a vote. If the majority in a century votes yes, then that whole century votes yes. Centuries were formed on the basis of wealth, that is, what kind of equipment you could bring to fight with, what you could spend on your military kit, what kind of equipment you could afford. The richest class of Romans provided 80 centuries of infantry and 18 centuries of cavalry to the army. The second class provided 40 centuries of infantry, and on down the line until you get to the sixth class, the lowest class of Roman citizens, the poorest men in Rome, and they pooled their resources to provide 1 century. Now, what all this means is that the richest people in Rome, the richest classes in Rome, had 98 votes. The next class had 40 votes, and the poorest class had 1 vote. This arrangement gives an advantage to wealth in the process of legislation at Rome. In addition, when the centuries voted, they voted in order of wealth. So the wealthiest centuries vote first, and then the next wealthiest, and the next wealthiest, and the next wealthiest, until a majority is reached, and then the voting stops. So the wealthiest get to cast their vote first, and the poorest have to wait, and sometimes you don't even get to the poorest centuries in the assembly. When a majority was reached, the voting stopped. So often the poorer centuries never voted at all. Executive authority. Executive authority rests in the hands of two annually elected individuals, officials, called consuls. Each year, 2 consuls are elected by the Centuriate Assembly. Men could be elected more than once, but in the first 300 years of the Republic, this almost never happened. Individuals never succeeded themselves in the consulship, and a truly important person, truly important individual might actually serve 2 consulships in his lifetime. The consuls were the chief administrative officers of the Roman state during peacetime, and they were the commanders of the Roman army during wartime. When at war, they would act independently. Each of them would have an army of his own. But at home, they were required to act together. In fact, no policy could be initiated at Rome, no policy could be initiated unless both consuls agreed to that policy. Now, this system was, we can assume that this system was created in order to make a weak executive where they could only agree to something that was extremely important for the Roman state, and so not very much could be done. If you think about it, it makes sense. Before 509 BC, they are ruled by, most likely, an absolute foreign monarch, a despot, who makes all the decisions for himself, and the Romans are forced to follow. So when they put their new government together, their republican government, they create an executive power that is very weak indeed. It requires, at least within the city of Rome, that both consuls agree on any action before that action can be taken. Each consul held a power called imperium, which might be defined as the power to command, or maybe better, the power to coerce. Inside the walls of the city, inside the city of Rome itself, the consuls had the power to coerce citizens in the name of the state, to coerce citizens in the name of the state. And if citizens refused to follow orders, then the consul had the power of corporal punishment, the power to beat or imprison a Roman citizen in order to enforce his authority. When the consuls took to the field of war, when they took to the battlefield, when they went out on campaign, their imperium included not only the power to coerce, to beat or imprison, but the power to execute a Roman citizen without a trial as a matter of military policy. Now, the perfect symbol of this is the fasces. We talked about the fasces a few minutes ago. It is inherited from the Etruscans. When a Roman consul is in the city, he is followed around by 12 officials called lictors, and each official carries a fasces. Inside the city, the fasces, which is about this big, contains a bundle of essentially sticks, rods, that can be used to beat a Roman citizen if that citizen refuses to comply with a direct order from the consul. Then the consul can order a lictor to beat that citizen. When a consul goes to war, the lictors place an axe in the middle of the bundle. The fasces is now not only a bundle of rods to be used for corporal punishment, but an axe that can be used to execute a citizen that refuses to follow a direct command from the consul, who is now his general. So, that's the consuls. Now let's talk about the Council of Rome. And the Council of Rome is called the Senate. And the word Senate comes from the Latin word senatus. And senatus means essentially the old men or the old ones. Just like the Greek word for the Spartan council is the gerousia, which means the old men, the word senatus means essentially the council of old men as well. The Senate began in the monarchy as a body of advisors to the king and continued not only throughout the Republic, but throughout most of the empire as well, as an advisory body. The Senate could be said to make up or be comprised of the greatest men in the Roman state, the men who had the greatest prestige, the greatest authority. The Romans call that virtue auctoritas, the greatest prestige or authority. And it is basically a self-perpetuating body. One could become a senator only after holding one of the two highest elected offices in Rome. We've talked about one of them, the consul. The other one is called the praetor, who is a legal official. These were the two highest elective offices in Rome. And after a year in that office, ex-consuls and ex-praetors immediately became members of the Senate. Senators embodied the most important values of the Roman state. The members had enormous, as I said before, prestige. The whole body collectively had enormous prestige. Its members, or its membership, was regulated by two officers called censors. The censors, always elected in pairs, like the consuls. The censors are elected every 4 years, and it is their duty to do two things. First off, they take a census of the Roman people. Censor, census, that's where we get the word. The Roman word census means a counting. They take a census of the Roman people, and they determine how much manpower Rome has, how large its army can be. They determine essentially the military needs, whether the military needs of the Roman state are being met. Their second job, and some might argue their more important job, is to go over the list of senators. And if they find a member of the Senate who is, shall we say, insufficiently Roman, who engages in activities that the Romans might find morally or ethically offensive, then the censors have the power to strike that fellow from the from the Senate. He is excluded from the Senate, kicked out of the Senate. Now, the Senate had the right to advise consuls, and it was the consuls who would present policies, issues, as long as they agreed, to the Centuriate Assembly for action. So the Senate discusses policy, the Senate decides on policy that the consuls then take to the Assembly to be voted on up or down, yes or no. There's no discussion in this early period in the Assembly. The Assembly can only vote on policies brought by the consuls. The Senate regulated receipts and disbursements from the Treasury. They regulated, essentially, they had economic power over the Roman state. They decided how much money would be coined and where that money would go. The Senate had the authority to deal with all crimes requiring a public investigation. The Senate was essentially also the Supreme Court of the Roman state, including they had a power to try treason and conspiracy against the Roman state and willful murder. And finally, the Senate had the power to deal with all foreign affairs. The Senate had the power to deal with diplomacy, the power to deal with the relationships of the Roman peoples to foreign peoples. The Senate had the power to deal with all foreign affairs, which means over time the Senate will become increasingly more important as Rome expands into the Mediterranean world. Now, in its earliest days, from the 500s down into the 300s, Rome was also an aristocracy. And you may remember when I talked about the archaic aristocracy in Greece, Rome was also an aristocracy. And the biggest problem that Rome would face in the early period of its development was a conflict between the two classes of Romans, the aristocratic class and the common class. And this conflict is called the struggle of the orders. The struggle of the orders. Now, the aristocratic class at Rome was called the patricians, and the common class, the lower class at Rome, was called the plebeians. And in the earliest period of the Republic, the patricians, only the patricians had full political rights. Only the patricians could hold high offices, like praetor or consul or censor. And of course that meant only patricians could sit in the Senate. They made the laws. They designed those laws to preserve their interests. The non-patricians, the plebeians, had virtually no power over the state except they could vote in the assembly if they had enough wealth to vote in the assembly. These classes, the patricians also had some important religious functions. These two classes were hereditary. That is, if your father was a patrician, you would be a patrician, and your children would be patricians. If your father was a plebeian, you would be a plebeian, and your family down through the ages would be plebeians. The plebeians rightly believed that they were being oppressed, and they organized to try to do something about that oppression in 471 BC. In that year, they formed something called the Plebeian Council. First, they left the city of Rome. The plebeians walked out of the city of Rome. They refused to serve the patricians, and they formed the plebeian council to represent the interests of the plebeians. This council chose 10 men who were called tribunes, and it was the job of the tribune to intervene, job of the tribunes, I should say, to intervene between patricians and plebeians to protect plebeians. The plebeian council could pass resolutions called plebiscites. From the formation of the plebeian council in 471 BC, the struggle of the orders becomes the story of how gradually, slowly, but surely the plebeians get more and more rights. And I want to talk for a few minutes about the major steps here. In 450 BC, the assembly codified Roman law into what would be known as the 12 tables. The laws of Rome were placed on 12 large bronze plaques and placed in the forum where everybody could see them. The 12 tables, and these are the basis of all future Roman law. Perhaps about that time, each tribune was given the power to forbid any action that threatened a plebeian. If a tribune saw any instance of a Roman violating the rights of a pleb, that tribune could step between the pleb and the patrician and hold his hand up and say one word, veto. We would say veto, which means I forbid it. And that patrician would be required to stop whatever he was doing and just walk away. Now, the tribunes, in order to do this duty, were sanctified. That is, the people of Rome swore an oath that they would never harm a tribune, and that anyone who did harm a tribune would be an outlaw in the Roman state. He was not allowed, you were not allowed to give him hospitality, to give him a place to sleep, to give him food or water, and every Roman was required under this oath to kill anyone who laid a hand on a tribune. Well, what happens if you don't? The answer is the oath would bring down a curse from the gods on the whole Roman state. In 366 BC, for the first time in the history of Rome, a plebeian was elected consul. And from then forward, every year at least one consul would be a plebeian. Sometimes both would be plebeians. In 287 BC, with a law called the Lex Hortensia, the centurion assembly voted that plebiscites, the decisions of the plebeian council, would have the same force of law as a law of the centurion assembly. So after 287 BC, you essentially have what we might call a parallel legislative process in Rome. You have the old process, the Senate and Assembly, and you have a new process, the Council of the Plebs, that can pass a plebiscite that has the same power of law as any law from the Assembly. Well, after 287, we can essentially say that there's really no difference anymore between patricians and plebeians. They acquire sometime during the struggle of the masses, they acquire the right to marry each other. That is, a plebeian can marry a patrician and vice versa. They can both hold the consulships and the other elected offices of Rome. The only difference is, the only two places that are different is, of course, only plebeians can be tribunes, and only patricians can hold certain religious offices, because since patricians had always held these religious offices, the Roman people decided this should not change, because after all, you don't want to anger the gods. Well, now I've said something about Roman government. I've talked about the struggle of the orders. The rest of the lecture, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the two most important social institutions of the Roman people. The first one is the Roman family, and the second one is a patron-client relationship that really in many ways is the glue that holds Roman society together. So let's talk about the family first. Historians and archaeologists tell us that the earliest Roman families were subsistence farmers in Latium, in the area that would comprise Rome. That all the early Roman citizens, if you will, are subsistence farmers. They have very, very small farms. In fact, the average size of a farm might not be any bigger than 4 to 5 acres. And on this farm, they practice subsistence farming. They grow just enough food to sustain the family and maybe have a little to sell, a little surplus that they can sell for other necessities. But even the wealthiest Romans in the early period of the Roman Republic are nowhere near wealthy by our standards. They might have a 10 or 12 acre farm. Now, given the poverty of these Roman family farms, the Roman family is made up of an extended family that included all of the descendants of the eldest male in the family. In the earliest period, as I said a little while ago, these families live on very small tracts of land. They hopefully harvest enough food to supply the family and give them a little surplus. The most important member of the Roman family in this period and throughout Roman history is the oldest male, and he is called the paterfamilias, the father of the family. In Roman law, only the paterfamilias had any real rights. Only the paterfamilias could own property, for instance. The paterfamilias had life and death power over his descendants. He could kill them. He could sell them into debt slavery. He could exile them from the family at a whim. His powers were so great that the most powerful Roman general still had to obey his paterfamilias. He decided who his sons and daughters would marry. He even gave his sons an allowance, sort of, they would have to bring all their money to him and he would dole out an allowance. When a child was born into the family, if the paterfamilias ignored the child, it was exposed. It was taken somewhere to die. Now, arguably, the second most important family member was the materfamilias, the paterfamilias' wife. Her importance is attested in Roman law because she has essentially the power to whisper in her husband's ear and tell him what she wants and doesn't want. And so that's the paterfamilias. Romans had a very strong tradition of close-knit families with supportive members. They had larger families than extended families, like clans, who tended to support each other as well. Family loyalty was always important in Rome. Now, another very important relationship in Rome a social relationship that existed among the Romans is called patrocinium. Patrocinium we would call a patron-client relationship. It hinges on an agreement between two individuals to support each other and to provide each other with what the other can provide. Now, the agreement has two partners, but it is not an equal partnership. The inferior partner is called the client, and the superior partner is called the patron. The patron agrees to help his client with favors of one kind or another, maybe give him money if he needs money to tide him through, maybe help him run for office, always with the permission of the patron, of course. The patron might represent his client in court. He might help him with his political career, all kinds of things to help the client out. The client, first and foremost, promises to visit his patron every single day. He promises to support his patron's interests, to vote the way his patron wants him to vote, to follow the patron's lead in all matters. Now, patrocinium, I should point out, is a moral obligation. It's not bound by law. It is an informal agreement between two individuals. Now, looking at this system as a relationship between two people is one thing, but you should note that this is not just a relationship between two people. A patron might have dozens of clients or hundreds of clients. A patron of great importance, let's say a Julius Caesar, literally would have thousands of clients. And his more important clients would have clients of their own. And some of them would have clients. And so what you should really visualize is a series of sort of social pyramids with the most important patron at the top, and then clients below that, and clients to them below that, and so on down the line. One of the duties of a client was to accompany his patron in important matters, like when his patron goes to the Senate House. And an important member of the Senate, like, again, a Julius Caesar, when he leaves his home in the city of Rome and walks the 4 blocks to the Forum, might be followed by 2,000-3,000 individuals. It would look like a parade, a vast entourage. In fact, they said when Caesar walked to the Senate, a portion of the city of Rome simply shut down because the streets were clogged with Caesar's supporters. One Roman poet noted that unimportant men were those who made visits but received no visitors. In other words, an unimportant man has a patron, but he has no clients. He makes visits, but he receives no visitors. In the morning, at the homes of important clients, or patrons, at the homes of important patrons, clients might line up around the block, waiting to be allowed in to be received by their patron. So each morning visit to an important patron represented essentially a cross-section of Rome itself. We should remember, of course, that the more clients one has, the greater the entourage one has, and of course, the greater his prestige, his auctoritas. Remember that word. It's going to pop up from time to time. When one of the great men of Rome took a walk, say, to the Forum, he might literally be followed by thousands of clients. So that's my introduction to the Roman Republic. You should note that in some ways, the Roman Republic had features that were distinctly Greek, with a rather Roman turn. But in other ways, Rome was quite unique. It was a complex state that, as we will see, would grow into a vast empire. And next time, we'll begin to look at the process that transferred Rome from a small village on the banks of the Tiber River to the capital of the greatest and most influential empire in the ancient world.
All right, so Dr. Price, of course, gave us a very thorough examination of the Roman monarchy. When we come back for our next lecture, we'll move on to another stage in the political life for the Roman society, and that will be the early republic. We'll find out, of course, the kings, they're still going to be a head of government. It's not going to be a monarch, it's not going to be a king, but there will still be somebody in charge, and we'll find out, of course, if it's one person, two people, how the Romans will handle that as well. And other offices will be created in the Roman bureaucracy as well. There were two types of people here in Roman society. You had the patricians, who are the aristocracy, and then you have the plebeians, who are the common people, I guess you could say. And there's going to be friction. There are frictions between the two, and we'll have struggle for rights on the part of the plebeians in resistance to the patricians. That seems to be a common theme as well throughout all civilizations. Not just, of course, Romans, but the Greeks as well also had class issues and class tensions that they had to fight through at times throughout their history. All right, so when we come back, we'll find out more about the early republic in Rome. Until next time.